My name is Nadine, and I was 67 years old when my son stood in front of an entire dinner party and called me a failure. The words didn't hurt because they were unexpected, they hurt because I had seen them forming behind his eyes for years. It happened on a chilly September night, the kind where the leaves crunch under expensive shoes and secrets unravel like yarn. My son, Logan, dressed in his tailored navy suit and Rolex that caught every light in the room, raised his glass not to toast me but to humiliate me. To the woman who taught me everything not to do, he said with a smirk that split the air like a slap. Laughter followed, not from everyone, but enough to make my chest tighten. His wife Mariah chuckled behind her champagne glass, her glossed lips curled in silent approval. I looked around at the guests, Logan's investors, Mariah's parents, and a few scattered sycophants who came for the wine, not the warmth. They watched me like I was an exhibit, a relic they didn't expect to speak. But I didn't flinch. I simply smiled and placed my velvet clutch gently on the dining table beside the silver cutlery. If you have a similar story about betrayal from the people you least expect, tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. What they didn't know was that inside that clutch was the end of the illusion they'd built their lives upon. For the past 6 years, I'd let them believe I was a retiree surviving off government checks and goodwill. I lived in a modest duplex on Franklin Avenue with peeling shutters and an overgrown lawn that never hinted at who I truly was. Every Sunday, I arrived at Logan's estate driving a faded gray sedan from the early 2000s, usually with banana bread or potato salad in hand. I brought gifts, not because they deserved them, but because they expected them. The help would take my coat and stare through me like I was one of the antique vases gathering dust in the hallway. During dinners, I was spoken to in slow, careful words, like a child who couldn't comprehend adult ideas. "How's the hip, Mom?" Logan would ask while passing the potatoes, and the table would laugh like it was the cleverest joke. I smiled through it all, collecting every insult like coins in a jar, knowing one day I'd make a withdrawal. That day had finally come, and it was time for my return on investment. Logan had always wanted to believe he rose from nothing, that he built everything from scratch through grit and brilliance. He'd tell people that he grew up poor and watched his single mother struggle to make ends meet, and they would nod solemnly. They never knew about the family trust one never let him touch until he turned 30. They didn't know I was the silent partner in 3 of his ventures, using shell companies to move the money cleanly and anonymously. When he launched his tech logistics company, ArcLight Systems, I was the one who fronted the $500,000 seed capital through a Delaware-registered firm he thought belonged to a retired investor from Ohio. He thanked that angel in every interview, never knowing she was sitting in the front row with a thermos of black coffee and a neutral smile. He bought a $1.8 million house in Highland Ridge with a third bonus payout ArcLight earned, not realizing I was the one who structured the contracts. When the board demanded collateral for their expansion loan, it was my silent 62% equity that guaranteed it. I had done all of it not for recognition, but because I thought that was what mothers did, help their children thrive, even if it meant standing in their shadow. But love without respect is just charity dressed as sacrifice, and Logan never offered me even the courtesy of gratitude. Every time I visited, I was met with shallow hospitality and carefully measured contempt. Mariah would pretend to compliment my thrift store shoes and then whisper to her mother about how tragic it all was. Her parents, Gregory and Helen, wore smug smiles whenever I entered the room, like they'd rescued Logan from a legacy of mediocrity. "He's done so well for someone with such humble beginnings," Gregory once told me as I passed him the butter dish. The humiliation was relentless, but quiet death by 1,000 civilities. Logan had created a narrative where I was a cautionary tale, a footnote in his biography of brilliance. He'd even told Mariah I used to gamble, which explained to her why I never had anything to show for my life. The lies built his legend, and I let him stack them higher, brick by deceitful brick. Because I knew something they didn't, I owned the land beneath that castle of delusion. 6 months before that humiliating dinner party, I started preparing for the day I would expose them. I met with my financial advisor, Janice, a meticulous woman with a brain like a filing cabinet and a heart as fierce as a lioness. We updated every deed, rewrote every contract, and fortified every document with notarizations and timestamps. I asked her to create 3 simple folders, one for the house, one for the cars, and one for the company. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked me the day we printed the last page. "You could just cut them off quietly." But silence was no longer a kindness, it had become complicity. I had watched my son degrade me in the eyes of strangers, dismiss me in public, and erase me in private. If I didn't speak now, I would disappear forever. So I scheduled everything to converge on one day, one dinner, one perfect moment: Mother's Day. Logan hosted the annual Mother's Day gathering like he was doing charity work. He made sure everyone knew he was feeding his poor, old mother, who still lived on pension pennies and baked those weird breads nobody really liked. Mariah's mother complimented the table settings like she'd arranged the stars, and the air was thick with expensive perfume and quiet cruelty. I arrived 15 minutes early, my homemade lemon tart in one hand and my velvet clutch in the other. "You're early," Logan said without looking up from his phone, already annoyed that I dared arrive on time. "Helena, take her coat," Mariah ordered their maid, who barely concealed her disdain. I smiled politely and took my seat at the far end of the table, where the extra chairs were squeezed in like an afterthought. They served me water in a mismatched glass, while everyone else had crystal. No one asked about my life, my health, my thoughts. I was the decorative plant in the corner, silent, unmoving, unnoticed. The evening unfolded in a slow, predictable rhythm until Logan stood to give his speech. He always made a speech, even on days that didn't warrant one, his voice too smooth, too loud, rehearsed for applause he never truly earned. "My mother taught me everything," he began, raising his glass and flashing a smile so practiced it barely reached his eyes. "She taught me what happens when you settle, when you stop striving, when you fail to adapt." A few polite chuckles rippled through the room like poison dropped in wine. I watched Mariah lean in toward her father, whispering something that made him smirk. "But seriously," Logan continued, "if she hadn't struggled, I wouldn't have known how to succeed. So thanks, Mom. You were a great example of what not to become." Laughter this time, not polite, not hidden, just bold and ugly. I stood then, calm as a lake before a storm, and placed my clutch on the table. I opened the velvet clasp slowly, letting the golden envelope inside catch the candlelight like a blade. Logan's voice faltered mid-sentence, and a few guests turned their heads, sensing a change in the air. "What's that?" Mariah asked, her voice tight, her smile frozen. I didn't answer. I simply pulled out the first sheet of paper and slid it across the table to Logan. "That," I said, "is the deed to this house. Purchased 4 years ago under Whitley Holdings, LLC, my holding company." Logan blinked, then laughed, a dry, panicked sound. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but his voice was no longer smooth, it cracked like thin ice. "You don't even have a checking account." I smiled for the first time that night, not a polite smile, not a broken one. A smile sharp enough to cut glass. "I don't have a checking account?" I repeated, raising my eyebrows just enough to signal what was coming. "Logan, dear, I own 7. My voice wasn't loud, but the silence that followed it was deafening. Mariah looked for me to the paper on the table as if expecting it to burst into flames. I reached into the envelope again and pulled out another document, this time, the title to his Tesla, bought outright in cash. "That's not possible," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "You drive a 2003 Corolla with duct tape on the mirror." I nodded, still smiling. "Because I wanted you to believe I needed you," I said plainly, laying another paper on the table, this one for Mariah's white Range Rover. "Your vehicles were purchased using the Whitley account, which, surprise, is entirely mine." "Stop it," Mariah hissed, reaching for the paper like she could rip the truth into something less painful. But it was too late. The others were already leaning in, eyes wide, mouths tight. Gregory stood and squinted at the documents, adjusting his glasses while Helen covered her mouth. This is a joke, right?" Gregory asked, though the tremble in his voice betrayed the answer he feared. "I'm afraid not," I said, placing the final document gently on the table like the last domino in a chain. This is the stock certificate showing 62% ownership of ArcLight Systems. I've been your majority shareholder since the beginning, Logan. Every deal, every investor pitch, every salary you paid yourself, I approved it. I funded it. And now I'm ending it. Logan's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stumbled back, eyes bulging, face pale. No, this isn't real, Logan said, now pacing like a caged animal. This doesn't make sense. You don't even know how startups work. His voice cracked again, and the arrogance that once wrapped around him like armor was crumbling fast. You think I don't know? I asked, standing with careful precision. I spent 15 years as a venture capital advisor. Before that, I ran regional strategy for Pacific Synergenics. You were 12 when I was managing portfolios bigger than this entire dinner party's combined net worth. A few guests gasped audibly, their eyes flicking between me and Logan like spectators at a tennis match. I retired because I wanted to, not because I failed, I continued, locking eyes with my son. And when you asked me for help with ArcLight, I didn't say no, I said yes. But I said it anonymously, because I wanted to see the kind of man you'd be if you thought I had nothing. The silence that followed was long and painful, like a breath no one wanted to take. You're lying, Logan said, but his voice had no power behind it now. This is some kind of sick revenge. I laughed, not cruelly, but honestly, because the idea was almost funny. If I wanted revenge, I wouldn't have waited 6 years to deliver it during dessert, I said. This isn't revenge, Logan. This is revelation. I gave you everything and watched you throw it away. Not the money, I have plenty of that. You threw away me. And now you'll learn what it's like to build from nothing for real. Mariah looked like a porcelain doll mid-shatter, too still, too perfect, one breath away from crumbling. You're bluffing, she said, though she didn't sound convinced. If you had this kind of power, you would have used it already. You wouldn't let us talk to you like that. Her voice caught, and her fingers twisted the hem of her silk dress. But I did, I replied, calm as ever. Because I needed to know what you'd do when you thought I was irrelevant. I wanted to see how far you'd go. And you did not disappoint. I turned to the guests then, raising my glass, not to toast, but to mark the moment. Now everyone here knows exactly what happens when arrogance meets truth. Gregory sat down hard, looking at the papers with the dazed confusion of a man who just realized his yacht might be rented. Helen kept staring at the wine in her glass like it could offer answers. One of Logan's investors, Bryce, I think his name was, stood without a word and quietly left the room. Another followed. This can't be happening, Logan muttered, gripping the edge of the table. We're supposed to be launching the beta line next month. You won't be, I said. Because as of this morning, I filed the paperwork to remove you from the executive board. You've been voted out, effective immediately. Mariah gasped, and Logan looked like he might faint. You can't just take everything, Mariah snapped suddenly, her voice high and shrill. This was our life. No, I corrected, this was my investment. I leaned forward slightly, just enough to make sure she didn't miss a word. You've been living in my house, driving my cars, eating food paid for with my money. And you called me a failure. Logan looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw not defiance, but disbelief. He wasn't angry anymore. He was scared. What happens now? He asked, almost whispering. Now, I echoed. Now you learn what it means to earn. Logan slumped into his chair like a puppet with cut strings, stunned into a silence no one dared interrupt. Mariah reached for his hand, but he pulled away instinctively, as if her touch now carried weight he couldn't bear. Across the table, Helen muttered something about needing air, and Gregory was already halfway to the door, mumbling about legal ramifications. I stayed standing, calm and composed, letting them absorb the weight of their illusions unraveling. I won't throw you out tonight, I said evenly, placing the velvet clutch back into my handbag. But you have 30 days to vacate the premises, return the vehicles, and cease using any ArcLight resources. Logan opened his mouth to protest, but said nothing, his jaw trembling instead. You'll receive formal notices by the end of the week, I added. And Logan, I suggest you find a lawyer, one who specializes in fiduciary misconduct. That was when Daniel, ArcLight's CFO, who had sat frozen through the entire ordeal, finally spoke. "Wait," Daniel said slowly, standing from his seat at the far end of the table. "You're telling me this company, our company, was never ours?" His voice was flat, but his eyes were darting wildly, calculating damage. "Daniel, I've been watching your quarterly reports for 5 years," I replied, not unkindly. "You inflated profits, misreported expenses, and claimed bonuses you weren't authorized to take. Logan signed off on them because he thought no one else was watching. But I was." A few gasps rose from the guests who remained, half-eaten plates forgotten in front of them. "Those documents are already with the auditors," I continued. "If you wish to challenge the restructuring, feel free to do so in court. Just remember, Daniel, you were never a shareholder, only a contract-based executive." Daniel's face darkened like a thundercloud, and he took a shaky step back. "You can't do this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You've ruined us." I met his stare without blinking. "No," I said. "You ruined yourselves when you decided ethics were optional." Mariah was crying now, the mascara streaking her cheekbones like charcoal on porcelain. Logan just stared at the documents like they were written in a language he had never learned. "How long have you been planning this?" he finally asked, the words brittle and bitter. "Since the day you told a reporter you were self-made," I answered. "That was the day I realized you didn't just misunderstand where you came from, you chose to erase it." The irony was that I never wanted things to end this way. Not really. I had hoped, foolishly, that humility would find Logan as success grew around him. When he first pitched Arclight, he was still grounded, ambitious, yes, but eager to build something meaningful. I believed in him, which is why I wrote the first check. But over time, the gratitude faded, replaced by arrogance and a hunger to be admired by strangers. I watched as he stopped inviting me to board meetings, stopped updating me on progress, and eventually stopped returning my calls. When I asked him once about the warehouse fire in Arizona, he laughed and said, "Mom, you wouldn't understand, just leave the business stuff to the men." That was when I hired Janice and began laying the foundation for today. Not out of spite, but because I couldn't watch him bury himself in delusions and expect me to hold the shovel. After the guests had gone, the house was unnervingly quiet, save for the ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. Logan stood by the window, staring out into the dark garden, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Mariah sat on the couch, eyes red, face blank, the veneer of confidence cracked beyond repair. I remained in my seat, sipping slowly from the champagne I'd been served but never touched. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Logan asked, not turning to look at me. "Why did you let me believe you were small?" I paused before answering because truth, when it's raw, needs room to land. "Because I wanted to see you were without the safety net," I said at last. "And because some lessons only stick when they come with consequences." I placed the glass down and stood slowly, adjusting my coat. "I'll be in touch," I said as I walked toward the door, my heels echoing on the marble floor. Logan turned then, and for the first time in years, his eyes held something close to vulnerability. "Mom," he said, but no other words came. I paused with my hand on the doorknob and looked back. "You know where I live," I said softly. "The real me, not the ghost you made up to feel bigger." And then I walked out, into the night that was colder than I expected, but strangely freeing. The wind tugged at my coat, and for the first time in a long while I let it. I drove myself home, not to the duplex on Franklin Avenue, but to the real home I'd kept hidden downtown. A penthouse on the 21st floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows and no ghosts in sight. And that night, I slept without regret. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. The next morning, sunlight poured into the penthouse like forgiveness, warm and indifferent to the storm it followed. I stood at my kitchen island, barefoot, sipping coffee made in a machine Logan didn't know existed. Across from me, the city stretched like a painting, all glass and possibility, untouched by the drama of my son's unraveling empire. Janice called just after 9, her voice crisp as ever, already one step ahead. "The board resolutions have been executed," she said. "Logan's removal is official, and Daniel's access has been terminated." I thanked her and asked her to begin the audit process on ArcLight's spending, especially the company cards and expense accounts. We'll start with Mariah's travel, she replied without emotion. There are over $80,000 in charges from the past 12 months, including luxury spas, jewelry, and what appears to be an art collection. I closed my laptop with a quiet finality and took another sip of coffee. Peace wasn't loud, it was silent, deliberate, and overdue. By Thursday, Logan's belongings were being boxed up by a moving service I hired myself, just to ensure nothing accidentally stayed behind. He didn't fight it. He didn't even speak when I arrived to oversee the process. Mariah was nowhere to be found. Her social media had gone dark. Her rings returned in a tiny velvet box left on the foyer table. I found Logan in the garage, standing beside the silver Tesla I had taken back on Monday, as if he still believed touching it could change ownership. "Where will you go?" I asked, not unkindly. "An apartment on 8th, he muttered. 2 bedrooms, low ceilings, no elevator. I nodded but said nothing because pity would only deepen the shame. "You did this with precision," he added, still not looking at me. "Like you were planning a heist, and I was the vault." "It wasn't a heist, Logan," I replied. "It was a rescue mission. You just didn't realize who needed saving." He flinched at that, but not because it was cruel. It was the kind of truth that exposes not just the lie, but the weakness beneath it. "You're not broke," I continued. "You still have your education, your name, and a chance to build something on your own. But this time, without illusions." He didn't respond, only gave a slow nod before walking past me and out the garage door. I watched him go without calling after him. It wasn't coldness, it was respect for the silence he needed now. Some lessons grow in solitude, not sermons. And I was done preaching to a son who had stopped listening long ago. Back at my real home, I allowed myself something rare, a moment of reflection. I sat by the window with a notebook, something I hadn't done in years, and began to write again. Not emails or legal memos, but memories, fragments of who I'd been before I became someone else's mother, someone else's ghost. I wrote about Logan's 3rd birthday, when he'd asked if he could share his cake with the boy next door who didn't have any. I wrote about the day I bought my first stock at 22, wearing a blazer 3 sizes too big and trembling under the weight of ambition. I wrote about the morning I held my mother's hand as she passed away, whispering promises I never broke. These weren't stories for the world, they were for me. To remind myself that before I was erased, I existed fully, and I would again. 10 pages later, I smiled at the realization. The most honest version of me was finally free to speak. The foundation of ArcLight was shaky now, but Janice and I had no intention of letting it collapse. I appointed a new CEO, Leah Dorsey, a seasoned logistics executive with a record of transparency and operational excellence. Leah didn't waste time. Within 2 weeks, she reorganized the leadership structure, replacing 6 managers and reassigning department budgets. Staff who had once feared Logan now breathed freely, relieved that competence had finally replaced chaos. I met with Leah every Friday morning, not as an owner, but as a mentor offering perspective. "It's refreshing," she said during our second meeting, "to work for a company where the majority owner actually understands operations." I chuckled and told her to keep an eye on vendor kickbacks, especially those funneled through Daniel's old contacts. She nodded, already a step ahead, having frozen 4 contracts pending review. I left that day with more than confidence. I left with the satisfaction that something good could still grow from something rotten. Meanwhile, I received letters, dozens of them, from women I'd never met. They had read the article that quietly surfaced after a journalist at the Tribune caught wind of the ArcLight shakeup and traced it to me. The story wasn't sensationalized, but it was sharp. Mother outsmarts mogul son, reclaims company she built in silence. It went viral, not because of scandal, but because it resonated with women who had been sidelined, underestimated, and used. "You gave me courage," one letter began. "I've lived in my daughter's basement for 6 years while she spends my pension. I thought I had no voice until I read about you." Another read, "They called me forgetful. Turns out, they were just hoping I wouldn't notice what they were stealing." Each envelope, each message, was a reminder that this story wasn't just mine anymore, it was ours. That's when I knew I had to do more than savor my victory. I had to turn it into service. With Janice's help, I registered a nonprofit called Echo Room, a legal advocacy and resource hub for elderly women experiencing financial manipulation by their own families. We set up a hotline, hired 2 caseworkers, and partnered with a law firm to offer pro bono consultations. The first month, we received 83 calls. Most were quiet voices, unsure if what they were experiencing even qualified as abuse. But we listened, and we guided, and slowly, their voices grew stronger. I remembered what silence had cost me all those years, and I swore none of them would have to pay the same price. At our first official board meeting, Janice raised her glass and said, "To the invisible women, they're not invisible anymore." And I realized that exposing my son had not just changed my life, it had saved others too. 2 weeks after the Echo Room launched, I received a message that surprised me more than any boardroom betrayal ever had. It was from Helen, Mariah's mother, the same woman who once smirked at my shoes and spoke to me like I was a houseplant someone forgot to water. Her email was long, winding, and awkward in tone, but the essence was unmistakable: remorse. She didn't apologize outright, but she did admit that she had gotten the wrong impression and perhaps underestimated the role I played in ArcLight's success. I didn't respond, not because I held a grudge, but because I didn't know her closure. Some bridges don't need burning, they simply collapse from disuse. Later that day, Janice forwarded me a request from Gregory, asking to schedule a brief, confidential call. I declined. I knew what they wanted: to salvage their own reputations now that their daughter's marriage and social circle had crumbled. But dignity isn't a loan you can ask to borrow back. Mariah's departure had been swift and surgical, like the removal of a cosmetic feature gone wrong. She left Logan the week after the confrontation, taking only her clothes, jewelry, and the 2 paintings I gifted them years ago, which, ironically, were worthless prints. I heard she moved to Denver to live with a college friend who ran a wellness retreat in the mountains. According to mutual acquaintances, she told people the marriage ended because Logan became emotionally unstable after a family falling out. She never mentioned me by name, but the implication was clear: she wanted to remain the victim, not the co-conspirator. Logan, for his part, didn't defend her, not even once. I believe he finally saw her for what she was, someone who admired his success more than his soul. But I didn't gloat. I'd spent enough time measuring pain to know that sometimes silence is the cruelest revenge. And so I let them vanish from my day-to-day life like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. Still, Logan didn't disappear entirely. A month after the dust had settled, he emailed me, not with anger or demands, but with a question. "Would you be willing to meet?" he wrote. "Not as CEO and shareholder, not as judge and defendant. Just as mother and son." I stared at the message for a long time, not out of hesitation, but out of sorrow. Because I wasn't sure if those roles could ever be separated again. I didn't respond right away. I let a week pass, then 2. When I finally replied, I told him yes, but it had to be on my terms. We would meet at a small cafe in the Arts District on a Sunday afternoon, where no one wore suits and no one brought their pride. He agreed within the hour. The cafe was warm and fragrant with fresh bread when I arrived, and I chose a booth by the window where the light was kind. Logan entered 5 minutes later, no longer dressed in Italian tailoring, but in a navy pullover and jeans that made him look 10 years younger and 10 pounds lighter. He saw me and smiled, but it was a small, nervous smile, like someone visiting an old house they once loved and burned. "Thanks for coming," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "I wasn't sure you would." I nodded, then waited, letting him carry the weight of the silence. "I've been going to therapy," he started, eyes focused on his folded hands. "I needed someone to help me figure out why I became who I became." I didn't interrupt. I knew that story wasn't one I could tell for him. Some truths are only heard when spoken aloud by the person who lived them. "I used you," he said eventually, eyes still down. "And not just for money. I used your silence. I built an entire identity on the lie that I came from nothing, that I pulled myself out of poverty and shaped my own legacy. But all I really did was inherit your work and slap my name on it. His voice cracked then, and for the first time, I saw the boy I once knew, the one who used to bring me flowers made of construction paper and glue. I didn't want to be you, he admitted. Because if I was you, it meant I wasn't special. It meant I hadn't escaped. I felt my throat tighten, not from pain, but from something heavier, recognition. How many sons become men by pretending their mothers are ghosts? You didn't have to escape me, I said, my voice gentle but steady. You could have built on what I gave you. You could have honored it. He finally looked up, his eyes rimmed with red, but clear. I know that now. And I'm sorry. Not because I lost everything, but because I almost lost you. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his, old skin over young regret. He didn't cry, but he closed his eyes and held my hand like it anchored him. We stayed like that for a while, two people surrounded by clinking cups and laughter, sharing something no one else in the cafe could see. Forgiveness, in its earliest form, looks like understanding. And I was finally ready to understand. We met once a week after that, always in neutral places, always with a quiet understanding that trust wasn't a gift, it was a rebuild. Logan got a job with a mid-sized supply chain firm, entry-level, no special treatment. I want to earn it this time, he said, and I believed him. He didn't ask for money, not once. Instead, he sent me updates, new skills learned, small victories, frustrations that didn't end in tantrums. He even began volunteering with the Echo Room, helping us design a digital tool to track power of attorney violations. Janice was skeptical at first, but after 3 weeks, she admitted, he's not trying to prove anything. He's just showing up. And that mattered more than any apology ever could. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was beginning. 3 months into Logan's quiet re-entry into the real world, something happened that neither of us expected. One of the women from the Echo Room, a soft-spoken widow named Teresa, invited us both to a fundraiser dinner being hosted at a community center on the east side. I assumed Logan would decline. These events weren't exactly his scene, but instead, he asked if I'd attend with him. I think I need to see what you've really built, he said over coffee one morning. Not just the money, not the foundation paperwork, but the people. So we went together, arriving just after 6, both dressed modestly and without fanfare. The room buzzed with warmth, laughter, and shared understanding that didn't need explaining. Women greeted me like an old friend, and Logan stood quietly behind me, absorbing it all like a student at a new school. When Teresa took the stage and told her story, how her own daughter had drained her retirement account while smiling to her face, I saw Logan bow his head. Not from guilt, but from humility. After the speeches, Teresa found us at our table and pulled out the 2 folding chairs next to ours. I'm glad you came, she said, her hands resting calmly on the edge of the plastic table. And I'm glad you brought him. She nodded toward Logan, who had straightened up instinctively. I remember what you said to me in our first meeting, she told me. If they try to silence you, it means they're afraid of your truth. I didn't believe it then. But I do now. Logan looked at me, then back at her, his voice soft when he spoke. I used to be the kind of person you were afraid of, he admitted. Someone who used love as leverage and silence as control. Teresa didn't flinch. And now? She asked. Now, he said, I want to be the kind of person who apologizes without expecting applause. That night, after we said our goodbyes and stepped into the cool evening air, Logan walked me to my car in silence. I expected the night to end there, but as I reached for the door handle, he asked, Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't said anything? I turned to him, the parking lot empty and still around us. Every day, I said honestly. And every day, I thank myself for finding the strength to speak. He nodded, then leaned back against the hood of my car, arms folded. I think I would have kept spiraling, he admitted. I wouldn't have stopped until there was nothing left of me to respect. I didn't offer comfort, some truths simply needed air. Then I'm glad I ended it before you reached the bottom, I said. Because if I hadn't, we wouldn't be standing here right now. Not long after that conversation, Logan made a decision that shocked even me. He announced to our small volunteer staff that he wanted to create a second initiative under the Echo Room's umbrella, one focused specifically on educating adult children about financial ethics and elder respect. He called it the Ledger Project, and the name, he explained, came from the belief that every action adds or subtracts from a moral balance sheet. Most of us aren't monsters, he said during our planning session. We're just never taught how dangerous silence and entitlement can be when mixed with desperation. I watched our volunteers nod, a few wiping tears from their cheeks. Logan worked tirelessly over the next 6 weeks, developing workshop materials, drafting digital guides, and even filming a video series using his own story as a cautionary tale. We didn't promote him as a redemption arc, we promoted him as a lesson. And to his credit, he never asked to be seen as anything more. The video series launched with little fanfare, but it didn't need any. Within the first month, the Ledger Project had been shared over 10,000 times across support forums, elder care blogs, and nonprofit newsletters. We started getting emails from adult children, some tearful, some defensive, most confused. I never realized I was making my mother afraid to speak, one wrote. She stopped talking about her money years ago. I thought it was just pride. Logan answered many of the messages himself, careful not to moralize, only to guide. He signed each one a son who had to learn the hard way. At one point, I walked into our shared office and found him crying quietly, holding a printed email from a man in Arizona. He said he hasn't spoken to his mother in 3 years, Logan whispered. He thought she hated him, but it turns out she was terrified of being a burden. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Then let's make sure the next son doesn't have to wait that long. By the end of the year, the Echo Room had helped over 300 women reclaim stolen assets, restore legal autonomy, and reconnect with support networks they'd thought were lost forever. We held monthly meetups at the center, where stories flowed like wine and laughter became a form of justice. Logan attended every single one, never as a leader, always as a learner. He'd help stack chairs, refill pitchers of lemonade, and smile when women called him the one who turned around. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, a woman named Carla approached me with a small box wrapped in silver paper. "You helped me save my life," she said simply. Inside the box was a delicate porcelain hummingbird, hand-painted, wings outstretched. "It was my mother's," Carla added. "She always said hummingbirds were tiny reminders that joy moves fast, so you have to notice it." That night, I placed it on my kitchen shelf, right beside the first check I ever wrote for ArcLight, still uncashed. One Sunday morning, as spring returned with its usual fanfare of blossoms and renewal, Logan invited me to visit his new apartment. It was modest but clean, filled with thrift store furniture and plants he'd somehow kept alive. "I know it's not the penthouse," he said with a half-laugh, "but it's mine." I looked around at the walls, covered in photos and post-its with scribbled goals. There was no pretense here, no designer illusions, only quiet determination. We sat on his small balcony overlooking the city's East End, coffee in hand, legs wrapped in blankets. "Do you think we'll ever get back to normal?" he asked, not looking at me. I took a long sip before answering. "I don't want normal," I said. "I want something better, something honest, even if it's small." If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. Logan nodded slowly, his eyes drifting toward the horizon, where downtown shimmered under a soft, gold haze. "Better than normal," he repeated, as though testing the phrase in his mouth. "I think I can live with that." He didn't try to force the moment into something bigger than it was, and I appreciated that he was learning. There was a time he would have filled the silence with promises or platitudes, but now he let the stillness speak for itself. A gust of wind rustled the leaves of a potted basil plant beside us, and I smiled at how something so small could feel like progress. "The Echo Room's having its 1-year gala next month," I said after a moment. "I want you to speak." Logan turned to me sharply, unsure whether I was joking. "You sure about that?" he asked. "Not everyone thinks redemption makes for good PR." "I don't care about PR," I answered plainly, placing my empty mug on the railing. "I care about impact." He looked away again, jaw tense, mind clearly running through 100 worst-case scenarios. "What if someone stands up and says I don't deserve to be on that stage?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Then I'll stand up and say they're right, and that's why it matters you're up there anyway." He let out a shaky laugh, nodding without fully agreeing, but not resisting either. "I'll think about it," he said, and I didn't push further. We sat like that for a while, the quiet stretching between us like a tightrope we both trusted not to snap. And when I left that afternoon, I hugged him without hesitation. It felt earned, not owed, and that made all the difference. In the weeks leading up to the gala, we poured ourselves into preparations. Leah, now comfortably at the helm of ArcLight's renewed leadership, offered to sponsor the event through the company's community engagement program. "We wouldn't be here without the Echo Room," she told me during one planning call. "It's not charity, it's acknowledgement." Our volunteers worked tirelessly transforming the old museum courtyard into a space worthy of the women it would honor. There would be live music, catered food from local women-owned businesses, and framed portraits of the clients we'd helped, each one paired with a short quote about courage. Logan worked behind the scenes, helping with logistics, design, and eventually agreeing to deliver the closing remarks. "But keep the spotlight short," he insisted. "I'm not the hero." I smiled, but didn't argue. He was starting to understand that owning your past doesn't mean performing your guilt. When gala night finally arrived, I stood by the entryway in a navy gown I hadn't worn in over a decade, greeting guests as they arrived beneath string lights and soft jazz. The courtyard glowed with warm light and brighter spirits, the atmosphere rich with hope instead of survival. Leah was the first speaker, followed by Teresa, who received a standing ovation before she even reached the podium. The crowd was filled with women whose lives had once been whispered stories, now standing tall in heels and heels replaced with pride. Logan stayed near the back, making sure microphones worked and food didn't run out, but when I tapped his shoulder near the end, he nodded and made his way forward. There was a hush when he took the stage, not cold, but cautious. "Hi," he said into the mic, and I could feel the nervous energy ripple through him. "My name is Logan Ward. Some of you know me as the son of the woman who started all this. And some of you know me as the reason she had to." You could hear a pin drop as he spoke, but he didn't flinch. I stood at the center of a life built on silence and thought I was the architect. I thought success meant distance and power meant pretending no one helped you get there. He looked directly at me then, not seeking approval, just offering acknowledgement. My mother didn't just give me money, she gave me chances. When I failed her, she didn't protect me from the fall. She let me hit the ground so I'd finally learn what it meant to stand on my own. Someone in the audience let out a quiet amen, and a few people laughed gently, wiping tears. Logan continued, "I don't deserve a second chance. But I'm here tonight because sometimes the people we fail are the ones most willing to help us become better. This isn't a redemption story. It's a reminder that truth is the first step toward repair." When he stepped down, the applause came slowly, not explosive but meaningful, measured and honest, like the words he'd spoken. I met him at the side of the stage, and for a second, we didn't say anything at all. Then he whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me," and I simply squeezed his arm in reply. The rest of the night passed in a blur of laughter, dancing, and gentle reunions. Carla gifted me another porcelain bird for the shelf, and Teresa insisted on taking a selfie with Logan, calling him our cautionary mascot. By the time we began packing up, my heels were killing me, but my heart had never felt lighter. I caught Logan cleaning up dessert trays with 2 volunteers and realized that, for the first time in years, he was surrounded by people who saw him clearly and still let him belong. That kind of visibility wasn't earned with speeches or checks, it was earned by showing up. Again and again, without asking to be praised. That night, as I returned to the penthouse, I walked barefoot to the balcony with a glass of water and looked over the quiet city. The lights blinked like stars below me, each window a life unfolding, some loud, some hidden, all in motion. I thought about how much had changed in just a year, how the woman they once pitted had become the architect of her own second act. I had gone from background noise to author of my own narrative, and in doing so, taught others how to pick up their pens too. The Echo Room had given me more than a mission, it had given me back my voice. And Logan, in his own messy, imperfect way, had begun writing a new chapter alongside mine. one not built on power or inheritance, but on responsibility and effort. As I stepped inside, I paused at the shelf. The hummingbird was still there, wings lifted, always in flight. And I whispered to it, "We're just getting started." 2 weeks after the gala, I received a certified envelope from a law office I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was related to one of the many probate or guardianship cases Echo Room had started assisting with, but when I opened it, my breath caught. It was a formal apology letter on legal letterhead from Daniel Hess, ArcLight's former CFO. The same Daniel who had sneered at my supposed irrelevance, who had once toasted Logan in front of executives while referring to me as a sweet old lady with no business sense. Inside was a typed statement admitting to financial mismanagement, a list of reimbursements already made to the company, and a handwritten note attached with a paperclip. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I owed you the truth. You were watching the whole time, and I was arrogant enough to think you wouldn't understand what you were seeing. I was wrong. You were smarter than all of us." There was no flattery in his words, just clarity, earned too late to matter much. I closed the envelope and set it on the edge of my desk, next to a framed photo of the Echo Room's first client. That same day, Leah called to inform me that ArcLight had just landed its largest contract since its restructuring. City infrastructure expansion, she said, barely hiding her excitement. We beat out 2 major firms, and the deciding factor was our transparency ratings. I didn't need her to explain further. She was saying that integrity had become the new currency, and we were finally rich in it. I congratulated her, then asked if she needed anything from me. "No," she said. "You've already done the hard part. You made space for good people to do good work." I thought about that after we hung up. How often we stay in broken places just to feel important, instead of stepping aside so something better can grow. It takes strength to build, but it takes wisdom to know when to step back. That was a lesson Logan never learned until he had no choice. He called later that week, asking if I'd be interested in helping him draft a proposal for state funding of the Ledger project. "I want to take the program to public colleges," he explained. "Not just to talk about elder financial ethics, but to reshape how young professionals think about success, power, and family." I was surprised, not by the idea, but by the way he said we. There was no hidden agenda in his voice, no attempt to reclaim something that wasn't his anymore. He truly wanted to collaborate, not control. We spent 3 afternoons working on the proposal, bouncing ideas back and forth in the meeting space of a local library, drinking cheap coffee and scribbling edits in the margins. I caught myself laughing more than once, not out of nostalgia, but out of real joy. "You know," I said during one break, "you used to hate feedback." He grinned, flipping through the binder. "Yeah," he said. "Back then I thought feedback was just someone trying to steal my spotlight. Now I see it as someone helping me find the right light." The proposal was submitted the following Monday, and within 10 days, we received a request for an in-person presentation. Logan insisted I join him, not as a token elder, but as the originator of the very values the program was built on. "If they ask who taught me everything I know," he said, adjusting his tie in the mirror, "I'm going to tell them it was the woman who let me fail so I could finally learn." The panel was a mixture of policy advisors, education officials, and nonprofit evaluators, none of whom knew our story. They judged us only by the material, the delivery, the logic. And in that room, we weren't mother and son. We were collaborators with a shared mission. Afterward, one evaluator pulled me aside and said, "I've reviewed hundreds of proposals. This is the first one that felt like a redemption arc without the pity." We didn't celebrate with champagne. We went to a taco truck and sat on the curb outside the city building, legs stretched out, sauce dripping from our fingers as we shared a paper napkin. It was, hands down, one of the best meals of my life. 3 weeks later, we got the grant, $400,000 over 2 years, with an optional renewal pending performance metrics. The Ledger project was no longer an experiment, it was a movement. Logan's apartment became ground zero for lesson planning, recruitment calls, and pilot program scheduling. He hired a team of 3, a retired ethics professor, a former social worker, and a young community college grad with a background in digital storytelling. I want perspectives, not pedigrees, he told me, and for once, he meant it. I attended the first workshop as a silent observer, sitting in the back row as 20 college students filed in, notebooks and laptops ready. Logan opened with a simple slide that read, "Inheritance is more than money. It's the values we leave behind." And I knew in that moment that something good had come from everything we lost. Outside of our work, my own life continued to bloom in ways I hadn't expected. I started painting again, not just landscapes like before, but abstract scenes of resilience, hands breaking through soil, faceless women holding keys, old doors pried open by beams of light. I even had my first solo exhibit at a gallery downtown, and when I arrived for opening night, I saw Logan standing by the entrance, bouquet in hand, pride shining on his face like a badge. "You never told me you were this talented," he said, eyes fixed on a canvas titled Reclamation. I smiled. "You weren't listening," I replied. "But I'm glad you hear me now." After that, he started leaving little post-it notes on my door after each workshop session, quotes from the students or pieces of feedback that made him think. I kept everyone in a drawer labeled proof. It was during one of our afternoon walks around the lake that Logan asked a question I wasn't prepared for. "What would you want written about you?" he asked. "Not in an article. Not online. On a stone. You know, when you're gone." I paused, letting the question sit with the gravity it deserved. "I'd wanted to say I left something better than I found it," I said. "Not just things, but people." He nodded, then added, "You did. I'm one of them." We didn't say much after that, just continued walking, the gravel crunching beneath our feet like punctuation for everything we'd finally learned to say. Spring gave way to a humid summer, and with it came the first signs that Echo Room was growing beyond even my original vision. We had now expanded into 3 more cities, each one led by women who had once been clients and were now fierce advocates. Leah continued to guide Arclight with steady leadership, and Logan's Ledger project had already trained over 1,000 students across 9 campuses. One of our board members, a former judge, suggested we present our findings to a National Elder Policy Council in D.C. "You're changing more than lives," she said during our monthly Zoom meeting. "You're shifting the narrative." And that's how systems change. Logan prepared the data while I wrote the story, our story, but told from the angle of silence turned power. It wasn't about revenge. It was about how love, when twisted by entitlement, can become a leash and how breaking it can set everyone free. The trip to DC was my first time flying in almost 7 years, and Logan insisted on booking business class for both of us. "You earned it," he said, brushing aside my protests. "Besides, I snore and coach." We arrived 2 days early to prepare, but I secretly suspected he just wanted to make a memory out of the whole thing. He took pictures of the Capitol like a tourist and made me laugh so hard over breakfast at a hotel diner that I spilled coffee on my blouse. "This is revenge," I told him, blotting at the stain with a napkin. "All those years I couldn't get you to sit still for breakfast." "Yeah, well," he grinned, "turns out you're interesting when you're not telling me to do my homework." His tone wasn't defensive or sarcastic, just warm, a shared nostalgia untainted by bitterness. It felt like healing had brought us full circle. The presentation itself was scheduled for a Friday morning in a medium-sized conference room with oversized windows and an audience of 20 or so policymakers. Logan opened with the story of how we built the Echo Room, weaving together statistics with real testimonials, painting a picture that was both sobering and inspiring. Then I took over, speaking from the heart about the moment I stood in my son's dining room with a velvet clutch full of truth. "I didn't burn the bridge that day," I said, looking around the room. "I just finally walked off it and built a new one stronger, wider, and open to anyone ready to cross with respect." When the session ended, no one clapped immediately. Instead, they sat in reflective silence before standing to give us a rare and deeply felt ovation. A woman from New Hampshire approached afterward with tears in her eyes. "That wasn't a presentation," she said. "That was a mirror. Thank you for holding it up." On the flight home, Logan was unusually quiet, staring out the window as clouds drifted beneath us like soft regrets. "What's on your mind?" I asked, nudging his elbow gently. "Just thinking about how lucky I was," he murmured. Most people never get a second chance like I did. And I almost ruined it twice, first by taking you for granted, and again by thinking I could fix it quickly. I placed a hand on his arm and said nothing. Some moments aren't for analysis, they're for acknowledgement. You didn't fix it quickly, I replied after a while. You fixed it honestly. And that's what made it real. He nodded, but didn't speak again for the rest of the flight. He didn't need to. Later that month, Leah organized a surprise anniversary dinner for the Echo Room's founding team and closest collaborators. We met at a rooftop garden venue overlooking the city skyline, tables lit with candles, air perfumed with lilac and rosemary. When I arrived, they all stood and clapped, not in spectacle but in solidarity, and I was so overwhelmed I had to sit down before the speeches even began. Carla gave the toast. To Nadine, she said, raising her glass, who proved that the greatest power isn't wealth, but the courage to speak when everyone expects you to stay quiet. Teresa followed her with a second toast, to the woman who showed us how to turn invisibility into influence. Logan didn't give a toast, but when everyone returned to mingling and music, he walked over and set a small gift box on my table. Inside was a necklace, silver, simple, engraved with 2 words, "You mattered." That night, I stood by the railing watching the city below, Logan beside me, both of us holding glasses of sparkling water instead of wine. What happens next? He asked, not referring to dinner or the Echo Room, but to everything beyond it. You mean after all this? I said. He nodded. Whatever we build next, I answered. But slower this time. With room to breathe and fail and laugh. With people who aren't afraid to be accountable. He smiled at that. Then I'd like to keep building with you if you'll have me. I looked at him and saw not my son, not the boy who betrayed me, but the man who came back when he didn't have to. The following week, we began brainstorming a legacy initiative, one that could survive both of us, long after we were gone. It's not about branding, I told him. It's about longevity. If the system is going to change, it has to outlive its founders. We brought Leah in, then Janice, and even Carla joined in with her usual insight masked by sarcasm. We called it Foundation Forward, a coalition of organizations supporting elderly rights, financial literacy, intergenerational ethics, and female entrepreneurship. Not a charity, but a think tank, resource hub, and mentorship loop. Logan suggested an annual summit, and Leah offered ArcLight's network to fund the first few years. This is how we make it permanent, Logan said. By making it bigger than us. Late one evening, I returned home to find a handwritten letter in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a short message. You turned my cautionary tale into a curriculum. I'll never forget that. There was no name, but I knew it was from one of the students in the Ledger project, probably one who hadn't spoken in class, but had listened closely. I sat in my kitchen with the note in my lap, my tea going cold, the city humming softly outside. Not all legacies are loud. Some arrive quietly on folded paper in the spaces where you once felt small. And as I slipped the note into the same drawer that held Logan's Post-its and Carla's hummingbird, I realized something. My story hadn't ended that day in the dining room. It had only just begun. The morning of my 68th birthday, I woke to the smell of cinnamon and the sound of hesitant knocking. I opened the door to find Logan holding a small tray coffee, a cinnamon roll, and a single candle flickering in the center. I didn't want to barge in, he said sheepishly. But I also didn't want to text happy birthday like some teenager. I smiled, letting him in, touched more by the simplicity than any grand gesture. He set the tray on my kitchen island, glancing at the hummingbird figurine and the notes still displayed neatly under a magnet. Do you remember where we were a year ago today? He asked, lighting a second candle for good measure. I remember you thought I couldn't even make coffee, I said, amused. That was fair, he replied, laughing softly. But it turns out I just needed a better teacher. We ate together in companionable quiet, no performance, no tension, just a mother and son learning to like each other again. Later that day, we met the Echo Room team at the community garden we'd helped renovate last fall. Teresa, Carla, Leah, and the others had planned a casual birthday picnic, nothing extravagant, just lawn chairs, homemade food, and familiar laughter. The breeze was warm and fragrant with blooming lavender, and a jazz trio played softly near the benches. You always said birthdays didn't matter much, Carla teased, handing me a bouquet wrapped in newspaper. But we figured you earned this one. As I looked around at the faces that had once been stories of survival and were now leaders in their own right, I felt something beyond gratitude. It was contentment, the deep, rooted kind that doesn't ask for more. Thank you, I said, taking the bouquet with both hands. Not for the flowers. For helping me grow again. They clinked lemonade glasses in reply, and I sat in the grass, full and grounded in a way I hadn't felt in years. That evening, Logan drove me home and walked me to my door like he used to do when he was a teenager trying to look grown. Do you want to come in for tea? I asked, already unlocking the door. Only if you let me wash the cups afterward, he said with a grin. We sat on my balcony, the sky turning gold, then purple, then that quiet gray before the stars arrive. You're going to outlive us all, he said after a long pause. Not physically, maybe. But your work, your ideas, they're going to echo long after. I chuckled. Is that your attempt at poetry? It's my attempt at not crying on your birthday, he said, blinking quickly. I'm not great at this stuff, Mom. You don't have to be, I said. You just have to keep showing up. A few days later, the National Elder Advocacy Group published a full feature on the Echo Room and the Ledger Project in their annual journal. The article highlighted our impact, but also framed our approach as a potential national model. Calls began to flood in from universities, family law clinics, and even city councils requesting partnerships or presentations. Janice handled the influx with grace, building out a dedicated outreach team within weeks. Leah proposed a training certification program for organizations wanting to adopt our curriculum. They shouldn't just copy the model, she said. They should understand the mindset. Logan and I developed a facilitator guide together, complete with real-world scenarios, testimonials, and checklists for accountability. This isn't just about abuse, he noted as we finalized the draft. It's about agency. It's about teaching people to see their elders as mirrors, not stepping stones. I nodded, proud, not just of what we'd built, but of the man beside me who had learned how to build, not take. Then one afternoon, Logan showed up with something unexpected, a weathered black binder. I found this while cleaning out a box of old college stuff, he said, handing it to me. Inside were printouts of early ArcLight documents, concept sketches, and most surprisingly, old notes I'd written for him as a teenager. Little things I'd slipped into his textbooks or left on the kitchen counter. Take the long view. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one knows. Don't confuse noise for progress. Some had coffee stains, others were wrinkled from time and movement. I ran my fingers across the pages, overwhelmed. I didn't know you kept these, I whispered. I didn't know they'd matter until they did, he replied. They saved me. I just didn't realize it until I hit the floor. In late summer, a young journalist from a national magazine requested an interview, not about Echo Room or ArcLight, but about me. We're doing a feature on overlooked women who became forces for change in later life, she explained. You were recommended by 4 separate sources. I almost declined, not out of modesty, but because I didn't need the spotlight anymore. But Logan encouraged me gently. You don't have to do it for you, he said. Do it for every woman who's still sitting at someone else's table, being ignored. The interview took place in my living room, the hummingbird catching sunlight behind us. I told the truth, not just about the betrayal, but about the patience, the fear, and the unglamorous work of self-repair. When the article went live, it was titled, "The Woman Who Let Her Son Fail and Taught a Nation How to Listen." And for once, I didn't flinch seeing my story laid bare. On the anniversary of the day Logan once called me a failure, he invited me to dinner, just us, no occasion, no fanfare. He cooked himself, not a fancy meal, just roasted chicken, vegetables, and my favorite rice pilaf. I thought about how I could say sorry again, he said as we sat down, but I think actions are louder now. I looked around at the small, cozy space he called home, nothing like the mansion he once flaunted, but so much more alive. You've said sorry every day since, I told him. You just didn't use words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. This isn't flashy, he warned, opening it to reveal a silver pin shaped like a key. It's for you. For unlocking everything I refused to see. I took it, holding his gaze. And you, I said, for finally choosing the door. When I returned home that night, I placed the key pin next to the hummingbird and smiled. My life wasn't perfect, but it was real, pain, power, and all. I poured myself a cup of tea, turned off the lights, and watched the city breathe beneath me, each light a pulse, each window a story. Mine had started as a whisper, grown into a scream, and now settled into a song that others could hum in their own time. I thought about every woman still waiting to be heard, every family still walking the tightrope between love and power. The work would never be finished. But for once, I didn't feel like I was running out of time. I felt like I had arrived, right where I was supposed to be. And for the first time in decades, I whispered the words out loud, to no one, to everyone. I am not a failure. I was just waiting for the world to catch up. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you leave, there's another story similar to the one you just watched. You'll see it on the top left of your screen.